most stories about medieval Europe, the focus is almost always the same. Battles, plagues, kings, wars, hunger and fear. Documentaries linger on armies crossing fields, on cities emptied by disease, on the harshness of daily survival. Human life takes center stage, loud and urgent, as if nothing else mattered. But almost no one stops to talk about the quiet presence that existed alongside all of it. Cats were already everywhere. They moved through medieval life without ceremony, slipping between stone houses and timber barns, between firelight and shadow. A cat might appear near the hearth at dawn, stretch once, then disappear again into the yard or the street. No announcement followed. No one called it back. This was ordinary. Cats lived alongside people without being the focus of attention. They were present in kitchens, monasteries, workshops, and storehouses, yet rarely discussed at length. Their place was not defined by ownership in the modern sense. They were not managed, trained, or closely supervised. They were simply there. A cat might sleep on folded cloth while wool was spun beside it. Another might watch from a beam as grain was poured into storage. In a monastery, one could sit quietly near a desk where a monk worked by candlelight, moving only when the room grew cold. In a barn, a cat might remain unseen all day, then emerge at night when mice began to stir. No one planned this. No one instructed it. The arrangement held on its own. Medieval homes were built around warmth, storage, and shared space. Doors opened often. Rooms served multiple purposes. Animals passed through as naturally as people did. Cats belonged to this environment in a way that required no explanation. They crossed thresholds freely, coming in from rain, leaving again without notice, choosing their places by heat, scent, and silence. They did not wait to be invited. In many households, cats were unnamed. In others, they were known individually. The difference mattered very little. What mattered was that mice stayed away from grain, that food stores lasted through winter, that the small unseen threats of daily life were kept in check. Much of the cat's work happened at night, and so it blended seamlessly into the hours when humans slept. During the day, cats rested. They curled near walls that still held warmth from the fire. They settled into window light. They slept beside baskets, tools, and folded linen. People stepped around them without thinking. A cat asleep was as expected as a stool left where it belonged. This quiet familiarity appears again and again in medieval art, where cats show up not as symbols to interpret, but as background truth. A painted room feels complete with a cat near the fire. A kitchen scene looks lived in when a cat waits under the table. These details were not added for drama. They were added because viewers would recognize them immediately. At night, the balance shifted. As lamps dimmed and voices fell away, cats became alert. They moved along walls, into corners, across rafters. Their world expanded as human activity contracted. Mice emerged. Grain rustled. A different kind of attention took over, one that did not rely on light or sound. Medieval writers noticed this without trying to explain it away. Cats were described as watchers of darkness, as creatures who worked while others rested. The tone was practical rather than poetic. This was simply how the world arranged itself. A cat's presence did not demand affection. yet it allowed it. A hand might reach out while passing. Fingers might rest briefly on warm fur before returning to work. The exchange stayed small and unspoken. Nothing needed to be made of it. Across villages, towns, cloisters, farms, and ports, cats occupied the margins of human life, and in doing so, quietly held it together. They were neither wild nor fully contained. They belonged without being owned, worked without being directed, and rested wherever the day allowed. This quiet role is what made medieval cats so enduring. While history remembers noise, cats lived in the background, by the fire, along the walls, moving softly between the hours. Medieval cats lived their lives in between. They were neither fully inside nor fully outside, neither confined nor entirely free. Their days unfolded along thresholds, doorways, barn entrances, half-open gates, the narrow space between a warm room and the cold air beyond it. A cat might sit just inside a door, body angled toward the outside, watching rain fall without stepping into it. Or it might rest on the stone step, close enough to retreat indoors if needed, far enough to feel the open air. This position was chosen instinctively, again and again. Thresholds offered information. From these places, cats could sense movement, smell food, feel shifts in temperature, and hear sounds approaching long before people noticed them. A doorframe was not a boundary to a cat. It was a listening post. Medieval buildings encouraged this way of living. Homes were not sealed environments. Smoke drifted. Doors stayed open for light and air. Animals moved freely in and out. Chickens crossed yards. Dogs wandered between rooms. Cats learned quickly where warmth lingered and where mice passed through. They adapted without instruction. A cat might enter a house to sleep during the heat of the afternoon, then leave again as evening settled. It might return at night when kitchens cooled and storage rooms quieted. People noticed these movements only when they disrupted something, which they rarely did. Most of the time, cats passed unnoticed. This freedom gave medieval cats a wide territory. A single cat might belong loosely to several places at once. A barn offered shelter. A kitchen offered scraps. A monastery offered quiet corners. No formal claim was needed. Presence alone was enough. In towns, thresholds multiplied. Cats moved along walls and alleys, between shop doors and market stalls, under carts and benches. They learned the daily rhythms of streets. When to approach, when to disappear, when to wait. They understood human routines without being part of them. In rural settings, thresholds were broader, but just as important. Field edges, fence lines, granary doors left ajar. The places where stored food met the outside world were the places cats preferred. This was where mice crossed. This was where their work began. And yet, their presence was never loud. Cats did not announce themselves when they entered or left. They did not require permission. They adjusted their bodies to openings meant for people, slipping through spaces that were never designed with them in mind. Over time, buildings adapted too. A loose board, a gap beneath a door, a worn stone edge where paws passed night after night. These marks were subtle. Cats left few traces, and that was part of their success. They did not disturb daily life enough to be managed. They existed alongside it, flowing through it like smoke or shadow. To medieval people, This was familiar. A cat seen crossing a threshold did not raise questions. It was not seen as wandering or lost. It was simply moving where it needed to go. Its destination did not concern anyone else. This way of living made cats difficult to define. They were not livestock. They were not tools. They were not companions in the modern sense. They were something quieter. Creatures who belonged wherever warmth, shelter, and work overlapped. Creatures who chose their places moment by moment, guided by instinct and habit rather than command. In a world built on shared spaces and open doors, cats fit perfectly. They lived where inside met outside, where human life paused, where the day loosened its grip. And from these in-between places, they watched everything pass. In medieval Europe, cats did not belong to people in the way animals are said to belong now. They lived among households rather than within them, sharing space without formal claim. A cat might sleep near the hearth of one family, hunt mice in the storeroom of another, and pass the afternoon in a neighboring barn, all without anyone finding this unusual. The idea that a cat should be attached to a single person, named, fed on schedule, and kept indoors did not yet exist. Instead, cats were understood as communal residents. A household might say it had a cat, but the meaning was loose. The cat was part of the place rather than part of the family. It occupied the same environment as people, tools, animals, and stored food, contributing quietly without needing supervision. Its presence was accepted as long as it caused no disruption and fulfilled its purpose, which it usually did. Medieval homes were not private sanctuaries. They were shared working spaces. Cooking, spinning, repairing, sleeping, and storing all happened within the same rooms. Animals passed through freely. Chickens wandered in and out. Dogs rested near doors. Cats slipped between benches and baskets, finding their own routes through the clutter. In this setting, a cat did not stand out. It was not singled out for attention or affection, but neither was it ignored. People stepped around sleeping cats the same way they stepped around stools or bundles of wool. A cat's body in the way was a minor inconvenience at most, something to be navigated rather than corrected. This familiarity created a different kind of relationship. Because cats were not owned in a strict sense, they were not expected to obey. No one trained a cat to sit, stay, or follow commands. There were no collars to mark possession, no fences to contain them. A cat remained because it chose to, because the place offered warmth, food, and safety, and because its work was valued. If a cat left, it was rarely pursued. Another might arrive in its place, drawn by the same conditions. The continuity mattered more than the individual. What people depended on was not a specific animal, but the steady presence of cats in general, keeping mice away from grain and stored goods. This arrangement appears clearly in medieval law. In several legal traditions, cats are treated not as personal property, but as functional members of the household economy. Their value increases as they grow older and prove their ability to hunt. A kitten is worth little. A mature mouser is worth much more. The law does not protect the cat because it is loved, but because it is useful. Yet usefulness did not exclude familiarity. Cats learned the rhythms of the households they lived near. They knew when meals were prepared, when fires were lit, when rooms emptied for the night. They positioned themselves accordingly, appearing where scraps might fall, resting where warmth lingered, disappearing when activity grew too loud. People noticed these patterns without naming them. A cat might always appear when grain was measured. Another might always sleep near the same wall. Over time, these habits became part of the household's unspoken order. The cat's movements fit into the day as naturally as the movement of light across the floor. In monasteries, this communal presence took on a quieter tone. Cats moved through cloisters and scriptoria with the same ease they did through kitchens and barns. They were tolerated, sometimes gently scolded, often ignored. A cat curling near a desk did not interrupt work. It was simply another warm body sharing the space. Even when cats were given names, the relationship remained light. A name did not signal control. It signaled recognition. Calling a cat did not mean it would come. It meant only that someone had noticed its repeated presence. The bond stayed informal, flexible, and quiet. This lack of ownership gave cats a certain freedom. They chose where to sleep. They chose when to stay close and when to leave. They accepted touch on their own terms and withdrew when they wished. People adapted to this rather than trying to change it. Over time, this mutual adjustment created stability. Cats learned which households were safe, which people were gentle, which places offered warmth through winter. Humans learned which cats were good hunters, which preferred certain corners, which would linger near the fire and which would vanish for days. No one needed to define this arrangement. It worked because it required little effort from either side. Cats did not demand care beyond tolerance. People did not demand loyalty beyond usefulness. Between these low expectations, a long-lasting coexistence formed. In a world where survival depended on cooperation, shared space, and routine, cats fit easily. They asked for almost nothing, and in return, they offered quiet protection against small but persistent threats. They lived among people without belonging to them. Even in a world where cats live quietly and without formal ownership, they did not go unnoticed by medieval law. Across several regions of medieval Europe, cats appear in legal texts not as symbols or curiosities, but as practical presences whose value needed to be defined. These laws did not describe cats as beloved companions, nor did they treat them as disposable animals. Instead, they placed cats carefully within the everyday economy of the household. What mattered most was what a cat could do. In early medieval Welsh law, cats were assigned specific values that changed over the course of their lives. A very young kitten, still unable to hunt, was worth little. As it matured and proved itself capable of catching mice, its value increased. A fully grown mouser was worth several times more than a kitten, reflecting the real contribution it made to protecting food stores and household goods. This system reveals something important. Cats were not valued for their presence alone. They were valued for their effectiveness. The law measured a cat's worth by its demonstrated ability to do the work it was quietly expected to perform. A cat that could not yet hunt had potential, but not importance. A cat that kept grain safe through winter had earned its place. Irish legal texts go even further in describing cats as functional household members. In these laws, cats are classified by role. There are cats known for guarding grain, Others are associated with specific spaces, such as storerooms or barns. The law recognizes that a cat in pursuit of a mouse may move quickly and unpredictably, and allowances are made for this. If a cat causes minor damage while chasing prey, it is excused. The hunt itself is treated as legitimate work. This framing is strikingly calm. The law does not moralize the cat's behavior. It does not punish instinct. Instead, it accepts that a cat acting according to its nature is performing a service. The legal system bends slightly to accommodate this reality. At the same time, harming a cat carried consequences. If a cat was killed or injured, compensation was required. The amount depended on the cat's age and ability. Again, usefulness determined value. A proven mouser was more costly to replace than a young, untested animal. The loss was measured not in emotion, but in practical impact. This does not mean that medieval people felt nothing for cats. It means that the law spoke the language of necessity. In a world where food security was fragile, the protection of grain mattered deeply. A cat that reduced losses from mice and rats played a real role in survival. The law acknowledged this quietly, without sentiment. What is equally telling is what the law does not say. There are no instructions for keeping cats confined, no rules about feeding schedules, no expectations of obedience. The law assumes cats will roam, hunt, and live as they always have. Its role is simply to recognize their presence and account for their loss if harm occurs. This reflects the broader medieval understanding of cats. They were not controlled assets. They were contributors who operated independently. Their work happened mostly out of sight, often at night, and yet it was important enough to be codified. In monasteries and large institutions, this legal recognition sometimes became more formal. Records show allowances made for cats kept to protect valuable goods, including manuscripts and stored food. In one well-documented case, a cathedral provided a regular payment for the upkeep of a cat assigned to a storage area, along with access through a specially made opening. The cat's role was understood, accepted, and quietly supported. Still, even here, the tone remains practical. The cat is not praised. It is not celebrated. It is simply accounted for. By entering legal texts, cats moved from the background of daily life into written acknowledgement, but without losing their essential character. The law did not try to redefine them. It met them where they already were. Independent, useful, unobtrusive. In this way, medieval law offers a rare window into how cats were truly seen. Not as symbols of good or evil, not as pets in the modern sense, but as living presences whose quiet work mattered enough to be protected. They were not owned, they were not managed, they were recognized. And then, just as quietly, they returned to the margins of the page, continuing their lives as they always had. In medieval homes, the hearth was more than a source of heat. It was the center of the room, the place where food was prepared, light was gathered, and people returned to again and again throughout the day. Fire shaped the rhythm of life. It determined where people sat, where tools were kept, where warmth lingered long after flames died down. Cats understood this immediately. They oriented their days around the hearth, not because they were taught to, but because the hearth offered everything a cat needed. warmth, stillness, proximity without disturbance. A place where human activity passed nearby without demanding attention. A cat might spend hours near the fire, shifting only slightly as the heat changed. In the early morning, when embers still glowed and the room was cold, a cat would curl close, tucking paws beneath its body. As the day warmed and cooking began, it might move just far enough to remain comfortable, never fully leaving the circle of heat. This behavior became so common that it barely registered. People worked around the hearth constantly. Pots were lifted, bread was baked, ashes were cleared, and through it all, a cat remained nearby, asleep or watchful, part of the furniture of daily life. Medieval writers noticed this without exaggeration. Descriptions of cats often include their love of warm places, their habit of lying close to fire until fur singed slightly, their contentment in heat that would be uncomfortable for humans. These observations were practical, not poetic. They reflected what anyone living with a hearth would already know. The hearth created predictable patterns. In the morning, cats appeared as fires were stirred back to life. At midday, they retreated slightly as heat intensified and movement increased. In the evening, when the room settled and flames lowered, cats returned to their favored spots. People adjusted without comment. If a cat blocked a pathway, it was stepped around. If it slept too close to cooking, it might be nudged gently aside. These interactions were brief and unremarkable. The cat's presence was expected, not negotiated. This familiarity appears clearly in medieval art. In painted domestic scenes, cats are often placed near the fire, curled quietly while people eat, work, or speak nearby. The cat is rarely central. It does not draw the eye. But without it, the scene would feel incomplete. Artists included cats by the hearth, not to make a statement, but to signal realism. Viewers recognized the image immediately. A hearth without a cat felt unfinished. The fire also created a shared boundary. Cats remained close enough to human life to observe it without being immersed in it. From their place near the hearth, they could watch feet pass, hear voices rise and fall, sense when meals were being prepared. They could leave when noise grew too sharp and return when calm returned. This balance suited both sides. Cats received warmth and safety. Humans received quiet companionship that did not interrupt work or rest. Neither demanded more than the other was willing to give. In colder months, the hearth became even more important. Stone walls held little heat. Night temperatures dropped sharply. A cat near the fire conserved energy, sleeping longer, moving less. People noticed this seasonal change without naming it. A cat drawn closer to the hearth in winter was as natural as heavier clothing or thicker blankets. Sometimes, a cat chose a place so close to the fire that it risked singeing its fur. This detail appears often enough in medieval descriptions to suggest it was common. Cats misjudged heat, or perhaps valued it so highly that small discomfort did not deter them. The image is intimate and unguarded, a creature seeking comfort without calculation. Touch often happened here. Hands reached out while tending the fire. Fingers brushed fur absently. A cat purred or shifted but did not leave. These moments were brief, unplanned, and easily forgotten. They did not carry meaning beyond the moment itself. And yet, Over time, they accumulated. The hearth became the place where humans and cats shared space most consistently, not through intention, but through habit. Not through affection alone, but through shared need for warmth and rest. As the day ended and the fire dimmed, cats often remained. They settled into the cooling ashes, into nearby straw, into the soft darkness that followed light. When people slept, the hearth remained as a quiet anchor, and the cat stayed close, guarding warmth long after everyone else drifted away. In this way, the hearth shaped the rhythm of a cat's life, as much as it shaped human life. It marked the passing of hours. It offered refuge without confinement. It asked nothing in return. For medieval cats, the hearth was not a luxury. It was simply where the day returned again and again. Meals in medieval homes were rarely quiet, but they were familiar. Food was prepared in shared rooms, eaten close to the hearth, passed from hand to hand. People sat on benches, stools, or the edges of chests. Bowls were placed where space allowed. Conversation rose and fell with the rhythm of eating, and beneath all of it, cats waited. They lingered under tables and near benches, moving carefully between feet and hems, watching for what might fall. A cat knew the sound of bread breaking, the scrape of a wooden bowl, the moment when attention shifted away from the floor. These small signals guided its patience. Cats did not beg loudly. They positioned themselves where scraps were most likely to appear. A dropped crust, a sliver of meat, a bit of cheese brushed aside. They learned which people were careless, which places were generous, and which moments were worth waiting through. Medieval writers noticed this presence with mild irritation rather than surprise. Household guides and etiquette manuals occasionally advised hosts to drive out dogs and cats before meals. The advice itself is telling. It suggests that animals underfoot during dining were common enough to warrant comment. Cats did not need to be invited to the table. They were already there. This advice was not always followed. In many homes, cats were tolerated during meals as long as they did not disrupt them. A cat brushing against a leg or slipping beneath a bench was part of the scene. People adjusted their feet, shifted slightly, and continued eating. The negotiation was quiet and ongoing. If a cat reached too far, it might be nudged away. If it lingered too persistently, someone might clap or hiss softly. But these corrections were brief. The cat retreated, waited, and tried again later. No one expected perfect behavior. Cats learned household limits through repetition rather than punishment. They discovered how close they could come, how long they could wait, and which scraps were offered deliberately and which were accidents. Over time, this knowledge became instinctive. The space beneath the table became a familiar territory. From there, a cat could observe everything: hands moving, plates being cleared, children shifting restlessly. The cat remained low and quiet, present without demanding notice. Sometimes, scraps were given intentionally. A piece of bread might be tossed aside. A bit of fat might be dropped near the wall. These gestures were small, almost absent-minded, but they reinforced the unspoken agreement. The cat stayed nearby. The household benefited from its presence. Food passed quietly between them. This exchange did not require affection. It did not depend on calling or coaxing. It functioned through routine and familiarity. The cat understood that meals brought opportunity, but not certainty. People understood that a cat beneath the table was part of daily life, not a disruption of it. In larger households, the pattern repeated across spaces. In kitchens where servants worked, cats waited near chopping blocks and preparation tables. In workshops, they lingered near benches where workers paused to eat. In monasteries, cats learned the rhythm of communal meals, appearing when bowls were filled and disappearing when silence returned. These movements were subtle. Cats rarely drew attention to themselves. They did not compete with dogs or demand scraps loudly. Their presence was quieter, more patient, more easily overlooked. This patience suited them. By remaining near but not intrusive, cats secured a steady stream of small rewards. Over time, these moments added up. A crumb here, a bone scrap there, enough to supplement what they hunted on their own. The household adapted without thought. People learned to expect a cat beneath the table. Its absence would have felt more noticeable than its presence. A floor without a waiting shape, without quiet eyes tracking movement, would have seemed oddly empty. When meals ended, cats often lingered. They remained beneath benches as bowls were cleared and conversation slowed. Only when the room emptied or attention shifted elsewhere did they move on, slipping away to rest or patrol. In this way, cats wove themselves into the daily ritual of eating, not as guests, not as intruders, but as quiet participants, moving carefully through human routines, asking for little and receiving just enough. Beneath the table, near the bench, always waiting. When the day was fully awake, medieval cats grew still. After the early movements of morning and the small opportunities offered by mealtime, cats settled into long stretches of rest. Daylight was not their most active hour. It was a time for listening without moving, for watching with half-closed eyes, for remaining present without effort. They chose their resting places carefully. Windowsills that caught the sun. Piles of folded linen that held warmth and scent. The edges of work tables where tools were set down between tasks. These places offered comfort without isolation. A cat could sleep and still sense the life moving around it. In medieval homes, stillness rarely meant silence. Rooms were busy. Spinning wheels hummed. Footsteps crossed the floor. Tools scraped and tapped. Children moved in and out. And through all of this, cats slept. They did not seek private rooms. There were few such spaces. Instead, they adapted to shared environments, resting openly where work continued around them. Their bodies softened. Breathing slowed. Eyes closed, then opened briefly, then closed again. This kind of rest required trust. Cats learned which sounds were harmless and which signaled change. A dropped spoon did not disturb them. A voice rising in conversation did not send them fleeing. Only sharp or unfamiliar sounds prompted a flick of the ear or a slight shift in posture. They remained alert without effort. A cat sleeping in daylight was never fully unconscious. Its awareness stayed lightly engaged, ready to respond without tension. This allowed it to rest deeply while remaining part of the room. People noticed this without comment. A cat asleep during the day was expected. No one worried about it. No one tried to wake it. It was understood that cats rested when humans worked, and worked when humans slept. The pattern felt natural. Cats adapted their resting habits to the spaces available. In workshops, they slept near benches where craftsmen paused between tasks. In kitchens, they rested against walls warmed by earlier cooking. In storerooms, they curled atop sacks or baskets, their bodies shaped to the uneven surfaces. These places were not chosen for beauty. They were chosen for function. Warmth, familiar scent, a clear view of entrances. Cats arranged themselves in ways that allowed rest without vulnerability. Even in busy rooms, they found quiet. A cat might sleep through conversation, through the steady movement of hands and feet, through the shifting light of the day. It learned the rhythms of human activity and let those rhythms carry it into rest. This ability to sleep amid movement made cats easy to live with. They did not demand stillness. They did not require special accommodations. Their rest fit into the household rather than reshaping it. In medieval art and writing, cats are often shown curled in corners or resting beneath windows. These images are not dramatic. They reflect observation. Anyone who lived with cats recognized these poses immediately. A cat stretched in sunlight, a cat tucked against a wall, a cat resting among tools. These images signaled familiarity. Rest also served a practical purpose. By conserving energy during daylight hours, cats remained prepared for night work. Their bodies recovered, muscles loosened, attention reset. The long, still hours of the day were not wasted time. They were preparation. As afternoon wore on, cats might shift slightly. They adjusted their position as the sun moved. They rose briefly to groom, then settled again. They responded to changes in the room without fully waking. Grooming itself became part of rest. A cat licking its fur slowly, methodically, was both cleaning and calming itself. The motion repeated until the body relaxed again and sleep returned. People moved around these resting forms without thinking. A sleeping cat was an accepted part of the room. It belonged there as much as the table or the loom. Its presence did not interrupt work. It completed the scene. When daylight began to fade, cats stirred. Eyes opened more fully. Bodies stretched. Ears turned toward the sounds of evening. The stillness of rest gave way to a different kind of attention. But until then, during the long shared hours of daylight, cats remained where they were, resting openly, listening quietly, part of the room, without effort or demand. In the busy heart of medieval life, cats slept, and in doing so, they made stillness visible. When evening settled and daylight withdrew, medieval cats began to move. As fires dimmed and voices softened, their stillness dissolved into attention. Bodies that had rested through the day stretched slowly. Ears turned toward sounds humans no longer noticed. The room changed, and the cat changed with it. Night was not empty. It was filled with small movements. The rustle of grain, the scrape of a mouse behind a wall, the soft shift of stored goods settling into place. These sounds carried meaning for cats, guiding them through spaces that now belonged more to them than to people. Medieval writers observed this transition clearly. One early riddle describes the cat as a creature with a loud voice and gentle footfall, one who watches in darkness and hunts unseen thieves by night. The description is brief and practical. It does not romanticize the cat's work. It simply records what people saw and heard after lamps were put out. Cats moved with precision. They followed walls and beams, tracing paths they had memorized through repetition. Their paws landed lightly, spreading weight so that sound rarely followed. Whiskers brushed surfaces before bodies passed, measuring space without sight. This silence was essential. Mice emerged when rooms grew quiet. Grain stores, safe during the day, became active at night. Cats responded without urgency, slipping into corners, pausing, listening. The work required patience. A cat might wait motionless for long periods, eyes fixed on a narrow opening. Its body remained ready but relaxed. When movement came, it was met with sudden speed, then stillness again. People slept through most of this. The cat's labor happened while households rested. In this way, cats protected food and stores without interrupting daily life. Their presence reduced loss without demanding attention or acknowledgement. This arrangement was understood, even if rarely spoken aloud. Households expected that grain would remain intact overnight. They trusted that unseen work would be done. The cat's success was measured by absence. Fewer mice, less spoilage. Quiet mornings. Cats adapted their routes to the night. They climbed beams, crossed rafters, slipped through low openings, and moved between buildings. In barns and storerooms, they learned where mice entered and where they hid. Over time, these paths became habitual. In towns, cats expanded their territory after dark. Streets emptied, market stalls closed, sounds softened. Cats moved freely along walls and rooftops, traveling farther than they did during the day. The night allowed them to cross spaces that felt crowded in sunlight. Their work remained the same. Hunting did not require noise or speed alone. It required attention. Cats paused often, listening, adjusting, waiting. They responded to small cues rather than obvious movement. Medieval people noticed this vigilance. Descriptions of cats often emphasize their watchfulness at night. Eyes that reflected light. Bodies that appeared suddenly, then vanished. These details were familiar rather than frightening. They reflected everyday observation. Night work also shaped a cat's temperament. Because much of its activity occurred in darkness, the cat became associated with quiet independence. It did not rely on human direction. It did not need encouragement. It worked according to its own rhythms. This independence was accepted. Cats were not expected to guard in the way dogs were. They did not bark or patrol visibly. Their contribution was subtle and easily overlooked. In some households, people glimpsed this work. A lamp might be lifted briefly. A shadow might move along the wall. A cat might appear with prey, then disappear again before anyone spoke. These moments passed without comment. By morning, the work was done. Cats returned to their resting places as light crept back into rooms. They settled near warmth, bodies easing into sleep again. The cycle repeated without ceremony. Day belonged to people. Night belonged to cats. This division did not require rules or instruction. It emerged naturally from shared living and repeated itself across centuries. On silent paws, cats kept watch. And while most of the world slept, they worked quietly in the dark, holding the fragile balance of daily life together. In one small poem from the early medieval period, A monk pauses his writing to describe a cat. The poem is simple. It does not tell a story. It does not offer instruction. It merely observes two beings sharing a room, each absorbed in their own work. The monk names the cat Pangur Ban, and in doing so, makes visible a relationship that was otherwise easy to overlook. Both work in silence. The monk sits at his desk, copying words by candlelight. His task requires focus, patience, and repetition. He searches for the right phrasing, the right understanding, the right place to pause. Progress is slow and measured. Nearby, the cat hunts. Pangur Ban waits for mice, watching narrow openings, listening for movement. His work also requires stillness and attention. He remains poised for long stretches, doing nothing until the moment arrives, then acting quickly and returning to calm. The poem does not compare the cat to the monk as a symbol. It compares them as equals in effort. Each has a different task, but the structure of their work is the same. Concentration, patience, quiet persistence. When the monk succeeds in understanding a difficult passage, he feels satisfaction. When the cat catches a mouse, it feels satisfaction of a different kind. Both experiences are complete within themselves. This parallel is gentle. The poem does not praise one form of work over the other. It does not suggest that scholarship is superior to hunting, or that hunting is more honest than study. It simply places them side by side and allows the resemblance to stand. In doing so, it reveals how cats were perceived in these spaces. Pangur Ban is not a distraction. He is not a nuisance. He is not a pet meant to entertain or comfort. He is a fellow worker, sharing the same hours and the same room, each absorbed in a private task. The monk does not command the cat. He does not expect Pangur Ban to respond to him. The cat follows its own rhythm, entering and leaving the room as needed, appearing only when the work requires it. Their companionship exists without conversation or instruction. This kind of relationship fit well within monastic life. Monasteries valued silence, routine, and solitary focus. A cat that moved quietly, worked independently, and rested without disturbance fit naturally into this environment. The cat did not interrupt prayer or study. It participated in the shared stillness. The poem suggests familiarity, built through repetition. Day after day, the monk writes. Night after night, the cat hunts. They share light and darkness, rest and attention, without interfering with one another. Over time, this coexistence becomes comfortable. The monk notices the cat not because it seeks attention, but because its work mirrors his own. Both pursue a narrow goal within a wide silence. Both accept long periods without visible progress. Both act when the moment arrives, then return to waiting. This recognition feels intimate without being sentimental. The monk does not describe affection in modern terms. He does not speak of love or companionship. He speaks of understanding. He sees the cat clearly, not as a symbol, but as a being engaged in its own necessary labor. In this way, Pangur Ban becomes representative of many medieval cats whose presence was rarely recorded. They shared workspaces without being acknowledged. They contributed without being praised. They lived alongside people whose tasks looked very different on the surface. yet required similar patience and focus. The poem gives voice to something usually left unsaid: that cats and humans, when sharing space quietly, often mirror one another more than either realizes. Each absorbed, each intent, each content in the act of doing. When the candle burns low and the room grows quiet, both remain. The monk continues his writing. The cat continues his watch. Two kinds of work unfolding side by side, without comment, without interruption, held together by shared silence. In some corners of medieval life, solitude was chosen deliberately. Anchorites and anchoresses withdrew from ordinary society, living in small cells attached to churches or set slightly apart from them. These spaces were designed for stillness, prayer, and long hours of quiet reflection. The door was sealed, the world narrowed, life became focused inward, and yet, even here, one animal was sometimes permitted. Guides written for anchoritic life laid out strict rules. Possessions were limited, visitors were controlled, comforts were discouraged. The goal was to remove distraction and allow the mind to settle fully into contemplation. Within these rules, an exception appears. The Ancrine Rule, a guide written for anchoresses, allows one companion, not a servant, not a visitor, a cat. The allowance is brief and unadorned. It does not justify itself. It simply acknowledges that a cat may be kept. This small detail carries weight. It suggests that even in a life dedicated to withdrawal, the presence of a cat was considered compatible with silence rather than a threat to it. A cat did not disrupt prayer. It did not demand conversation. It did not pull attention outward in the way people might. Instead, it shared space quietly. In a narrow cell, a cat's movements would have been easy to follow. Soft steps across stone, the shift of a body curling near warmth, a tail flicking once, then settling again. These sounds were gentle, repetitive, and predictable. They blended into stillness rather than breaking it. For an anchorite, whose days were marked by long hours alone, the cat's presence offered a form of shared existence without obligation. The cat did not require care beyond tolerance and the occasional scrap. It did not interrupt prayer or reading. It remained nearby without intruding. This kind of companionship was different from human contact. There was no conversation, no expectation, no need to perform. The cat did not ask questions or offer advice. It simply existed in the same confined space, following its own rhythms of rest and alertness. At times, the cat would sleep, curled near the anchorite's feet, tucked into a corner warmed by the wall, breathing slow and even. At other times, it would stir and move, circling the small room before settling again. These movements marked time gently. In a life where hours could blur together, the small changes in a cat's posture or attention provided quiet signals. Day had passed. Evening had come. Night had arrived. The cat also offered practical benefit. Even in an anchoritic cell, mice could enter. Stored food, parchment, and cloth needed protection. The cat fulfilled this role without ceremony, moving when needed, resting when not. But usefulness alone does not explain the allowance. Many useful animals were excluded from anchoritic life. What set the cat apart was its ability to be present without distraction. its independence, its lack of demand. The cat did not insist on closeness, yet it allowed it. If the anchorite reached out, the cat might accept touch. If not, it would remain where it was. This flexibility suited a life structured around inward focus. Medieval writers understood this quality intuitively. Cats were described as creatures who could share space without speaking, who could remain near without interfering. These traits, which sometimes frustrated people in busier households, became virtues in solitude. The cat became a companion in the truest sense, not a partner in conversation, not a source of entertainment, but a living presence that shared the quiet without altering it. Within the narrow walls of an anchorite cell, where life was stripped to its essentials, the cat fit easily. It brought warmth. It brought motion. It brought a reminder of the world beyond the wall, and then it settled again, allowing silence to return. In this way, even in the most withdrawn lives of medieval Europe, cats remained, not as comforts to be indulged, not as distractions to be feared, but as quiet companions, permitted precisely because they asked for nothing. The relationship between medieval people and cats was built on a simple understanding. Cats were allowed to remain because they worked. They were not trained, directed, or closely managed. No one showed a cat how to hunt. No one instructed it where to patrol. Its skills were assumed, inherited, and refined through experience. If a cat was effective, it stayed. If it was not, it drifted elsewhere. This arrangement required very little negotiation. A household offered shelter, warmth, and the occasional scrap. In return, the cat reduced the presence of mice and rats. The exchange was quiet and largely invisible, but it was deeply practical. Food stores lasted longer. Damage was reduced. The smallest threats were kept in check. Nothing more was asked. Cats were not expected to guard doors or follow people. They were not expected to respond when called. Their value lay in doing exactly what came naturally to them. This made the agreement stable. Because cats operated on instinct rather than instruction, their work did not depend on human oversight. It continued whether anyone was watching or not. The household benefited even while sleeping. This independence distinguished cats from other animals. Dogs were trained, commanded, and praised. Livestock were counted, enclosed, and controlled. Cats existed outside these systems. They were not driven. They were tolerated. Tolerance, in this case, was enough. A cat that hunted well earned its place through results, rather than behavior. It did not matter if it ignored people, vanished for days, or slept through the busiest hours. As long as mice were scarce, the agreement held. This understanding appears consistently across medieval records. Cats are described as troublesome to mice, not obedient to humans. Their defining feature is not loyalty, but effectiveness. The language used to describe them is practical, focused on outcome rather than character. Even when cats caused minor inconvenience, they were forgiven. A cat might knock something over in pursuit of prey. It might scratch or climb where it was not meant to. These actions were understood as part of its work, rather than signs of disobedience. The hunt excused the disruption. The agreement also allowed cats to leave. If conditions changed, a cat might move on. Another would often take its place. People did not pursue cats or attempt to bind them to a single household. The relationship was based on mutual benefit, not control. This fluidity suited both sides. Cats retained freedom. Humans retained protection. Neither side invested more than necessary. In monasteries, farms, and towns alike, this pattern repeated. A cat appeared where mice were plentiful. It stayed where it was tolerated. Over time, these places became familiar. The cat learned the territory. The household learned the cat. No formal contract was needed. The agreement existed through repetition. Night after night, the cat hunted. Morning after morning, grain remained intact. The absence of damage reinforced trust. This arrangement shaped how cats were perceived. They were respected for their function, not sentimentalized. Affection might develop, but it was secondary. The primary relationship remained practical. Yet within this practicality, something quieter emerged. Because cats asked for so little, they were allowed to remain close. They slept near warmth. They shared space during meals. They rested in busy rooms. Their presence became woven into daily life. This closeness did not require ownership. People did not need to claim cats as theirs in order to benefit from them. The cat's loyalty was to the place rather than the person, to the availability of shelter and work rather than to individual command. Over time, this created a form of coexistence that was remarkably durable. For centuries, cats lived among people under this same unspoken agreement. They adapted to new buildings, new routines, and new environments without needing instruction. The terms remained the same: shelter, tolerance, freedom. In return, cats offered vigilance. They watched when people slept. They worked when no one was present. They asked nothing for it. This was the working cat agreement. It did not need to be written down. It did not need to be enforced. It held on its own, quietly, as long as both sides allowed it to. Even within the largest and most formal institutions of medieval life, cats moved quietly through the background. Cathedrals were places of order, record-keeping, and ritual. They stored food, wine, candles, cloth, and manuscripts. They maintained strict routines and careful accounts. And within these carefully managed spaces, cats were present not as curiosities, but as practical necessities. One surviving record makes this especially clear. At Exeter Cathedral, a regular allowance was set aside for the care of a cat whose task was to protect stored goods. The entry is brief. It does not explain itself. It simply lists the expense, as one might list candles or repairs. The cat is treated as part of the system. There is no flourish in the language, no affection expressed, no justification offered. The record assumes that the cat's presence makes sense, that its role is understood, that its work requires no further comment. Alongside this allowance, there is evidence of something even more telling. A small opening was made to allow the cat access to the storerooms. A narrow passage, low to the ground, cut deliberately so that the cat could come and go as needed. This was not an accident. It was not a crack left unsealed. It was an intentional adjustment to the building itself. Stone was shaped around the cat's routine. This detail reveals how deeply integrated cats were into medieval spaces. The cathedral did not attempt to confine the cat or escort it. Instead, the building adapted. The cat was expected to move independently, to patrol on its own schedule, to appear where it was needed without instruction. In this way, the cat became a kind of quiet staff member. It had a role, it had access, it had support, but it did not have supervision. The cathedral trusted the cat to do what cats had always done. It did not assign hours or enforce boundaries beyond the small architectural accommodation that allowed movement. The cat's success would be evident in what did not happen. Fewer mice, less damage, quiet nights. This arrangement mirrors the broader medieval understanding of cats. Even in spaces governed by rules and hierarchy, cats operated outside formal command structures. They were not ordered about. They were relied upon. Their independence was not seen as a flaw. In fact, it was essential. A cat that waited for instruction would be useless in a storeroom. A cat that hunted only when watched would fail. The value of the cathedral cat lay precisely in its ability to act alone, to notice what humans could not, to move through darkness without drawing attention. The cathedral environment suited this work. Long corridors, thick walls, quiet hours after dusk, stored grain and wax that attracted rodents. These spaces required a presence that could navigate silently and persistently. The cat filled that role without ceremony. During the day, it likely rested where warmth and light allowed, near sunlit stone, beside stored cloth, in corners that remained undisturbed. People passed around it without comment. Its presence was expected, not remarkable. At night, it moved, through the cat flap, along walls, into storage rooms where mice emerged. The cathedral slept, and the cat worked. No record tells us the cat's name. No account describes its appearance. None of this was necessary. The important thing was that the work continued, quietly, reliably, without drawing attention to itself. The cat did not need to be noticed in order to matter. This institutional acceptance of cats did not turn them into pets. They were not pampered. They were not kept for comfort or companionship. Their allowance was modest. Their access was functional. Their presence was tolerated because it solved a problem. And yet, in making space for them, institutions acknowledged something subtle. That cats were dependable in their own way, that their instincts could be trusted, that their presence improved the stability of the environment. The cathedral did not sentimentalize the cat. It accommodated it, and in doing so, it revealed how deeply cats were woven into medieval life, not only in homes and barns, but in the most formal spaces of record and ritual. Even where stone and rule defined the world, a small opening remained, low to the ground, quiet, made for a creature who worked best when left alone. Medieval cats survived through a combination of hunting, scavenging, and quiet opportunity. They were not fed on schedules. They were not given measured portions. Their daily nourishment came from what they could catch and what the household allowed to pass their way. This pattern was neither harsh nor generous. It was simply how life worked. Hunting formed the core of a cat's diet. Mice and rats were the most common prey, especially in barns, granaries, and storerooms. These animals were abundant, persistent, and drawn to the same places people relied on for survival. A cat that hunted well reduced loss and protected food without needing to be fed in return. Small birds were sometimes taken, particularly in rural areas where fields and hedges bordered living spaces. These hunts happened quickly and quietly, often at dawn or dusk. Feathers might appear near a doorway or wall, offering silent evidence of work completed. Cats also caught other small creatures when opportunity allowed. Insects, frogs, anything that moved in a way that triggered instinct. These were not planned meals. They were responses to movement, moments of chance that added variety to an otherwise narrow diet. Scavenging filled the gaps. Cats lingered near kitchens and workspaces where food was prepared. They learned which scraps were edible and which were not worth attention. Bones stripped of meat, bits of fat trimmed away, crusts of bread. These were not delicacies. They were supplements. Occasionally, records mention deliberate feeding. A small purchase of cheese listed for a cat. A scrap set aside rather than discarded. These moments stand out precisely because they were not constant. They suggest kindness rather than obligation, acknowledgement rather than routine care. Most of the time, cats provided for themselves. This independence shaped their bodies and behavior. Medieval cats were leaner than many modern cats. Their movements were efficient. They conserved energy during daylight and acted decisively when food appeared. Their hunger did not make them desperate. Because food sources were scattered and unpredictable, cats learned patience. They waited beneath tables. They watched from corners. They moved on when nothing appeared. This restraint allowed them to survive without constant human intervention. Households understood this arrangement. People did not worry if a cat disappeared for a day or two. They assumed it was hunting elsewhere, following prey, or finding warmth. When it returned, it did so without ceremony, slipping back into familiar places. Food was not a reward. It was a byproduct of proximity. If scraps fell, the cat benefited. If not, it continued hunting. No one tracked its intake. No one measured its health. As long as it worked and remained present, it was assumed to be managing well enough. This approach extended to larger institutions as well. In monasteries and cathedrals, cats supplemented their hunting with whatever was available. Rodents in storerooms, occasional leavings from kitchens, small allowances when recorded. The expectation remained the same. The cat would find what it needed. Milk appears often in later folklore, but in practice, it was not a staple. Milk was valuable. It was used for people, for cooking, for trade. A cat might receive milk occasionally, but it was not guaranteed. Water, prey, and scraps formed the more reliable foundation. This lack of regular feeding did not weaken the bond between cats and people. If anything, it reinforced the quiet balance. Cats were not dependent in a way that created obligation. They remained nearby because it suited them, not because they were fed into compliance. Their diet reflected the world they lived in. It was shaped by availability, instinct, and environment, rather than care. Cats ate what the medieval landscape offered, adapting to seasons, settlements, and opportunity. In winter, hunting became harder, and scraps mattered more. In summer, prey was plentiful, and cats ranged farther. These shifts were accepted without comment. No one expected abundance. Enough was sufficient. In this way, medieval cats lived close to the edge of human life without crossing fully into it. They fed themselves where they could, accepted help when it appeared, and continued on without complaint. They ate what they found. They hunted what they could. They survived through balance rather than provision. And because of this, they remain free, effective, and quietly woven into the daily world around them. Although medieval cats were expected to provide for themselves, they were not entirely left alone. Alongside hunting and scavenging, there existed a softer layer of interaction. Small, irregular acts of kindness that were never required, rarely recorded, and yet quietly widespread. These gestures did not turn cats into dependents. They simply acknowledged their presence. Scraps were the most common form. A crust of bread dropped deliberately, rather than by accident. A bit of fat set aside while trimming meat. Bones placed near the wall instead of thrown into the yard. These offerings were casual and unremarkable. They carried no sense of duty. They were moments rather than routines. People did not feed cats because they felt responsible for them. They fed them because the cat was there, because the food was excess, because the act required little effort. The exchange remained light. Milk occupies a curious place in this pattern. Later folklore often describes milk left out for cats at night, especially as an act of charity or protection. In practice, milk was too valuable to be given freely or often. It required labor, livestock, and careful use. Most households reserved it for people, cooking, or trade. When cats received milk, it was occasional. A small bowl set out at night, a leftover portion nearing spoilage. A moment of generosity rather than an expectation. These acts stood out precisely because they were not guaranteed. In taverns and bakeries, cats were especially visible. These places produced scraps regularly and attracted rodents. Cats lingered near ovens, counters, and storage areas, waiting patiently. Bakers tolerated them because they kept mice away from flour. Tavern keepers allowed them because they reduced pests and added a sense of liveliness to otherwise quiet corners. Over time, some cats became loosely associated with these spaces. A bakery cat might sleep near the oven during the day and patrol flour sacks at night. A tavern cat might linger beneath tables and slip between benches, familiar to regular patrons without belonging to any one person. These cats were not owned, they were recognized. People learned their habits. They noticed their absence. They greeted them without calling them. The relationship remained informal and flexible. This pattern extended to private homes as well. A cat might begin sleeping regularly near a particular hearth. Over time, scraps might be offered more often. The household did not adopt the cat in a formal sense. The cat adopted the place. This kind of quiet adoption left no paperwork. There were no declarations, no ceremonies, just repetition. A cat returned each evening. A door was left open. Food appeared occasionally. Warmth was available. The arrangement held as long as it suited both sides. In medieval thinking, these acts of kindness did not elevate cats into a special moral category. They were not treated as vulnerable dependents. They were not pitied. They were simply included in the small economy of excess. What could be spared was spared. What could not be spared was not. This balance prevented resentment, because feeding cats was never an obligation, it remained voluntary. Because it was voluntary, it carried no weight. It did not alter the relationship. Cats accepted this without protest. They did not wait for meals. They did not rely on generosity alone. They continued to hunt, to roam, to provide for themselves. Scraps and milk supplemented rather than replaced their instincts. These small charities shaped how cats were perceived. They were not burdens. They were not liabilities. They were creatures who benefited from proximity without exploiting it. In towns and villages, this made cats easy to live with. They required nothing consistent. They offered something valuable. Between these two facts, tolerance grew naturally. Even when superstition cast shadows, these everyday acts persisted. A cat might be feared in one context and fed in another. A black cat might be whispered about and still receive scraps beneath the table. Belief did not always override habit. Habit was stronger. In the quiet repetition of daily life, cats continued to receive small kindnesses. Not enough to bind them, just enough to acknowledge them. A bowl set down once, a crust tossed aside, a door left unlatched. These gestures did not change the cat's life. They simply softened it. And in doing so, they revealed something enduring about medieval coexistence. Even in a world shaped by scarcity and labor, there was room for quiet generosity, offered without expectation and accepted without demand. Warmth shaped the rhythm of a medieval cat's life more than almost anything else. Stone walls held cold. Floors pulled heat downward. Even in well-used homes, warmth was uneven, drifting outward from the hearth and fading quickly into shadow. Cats learned this landscape by instinct, mapping the warm places as carefully as they mapped hunting paths. They followed heat. A cat would settle where the fire had burned earlier, even after the flames were gone. It would return to the same patch of floor day after day, drawn by residual warmth trapped in stone or packed earth. When the fire was rekindled, the cat adjusted, inching closer or retreating slightly as heat shifted. This movement was slow and deliberate. Cats did not rush toward warmth. They approached it carefully, testing with paws, circling before settling. Once satisfied, they folded themselves inward, conserving heat and energy in equal measure. Medieval observers noticed this behavior clearly. Writers described cats as creatures who loved warm places, who sought fire so eagerly that they sometimes singed their fur. This detail appears often enough to suggest it was common. Cats valued warmth so highly that discomfort did not always deter them. The image is intimate. A cat lying too close to the hearth, whiskers twitching as heat rises, fur faintly scorched at the edges. No one rushes to move it. The cat will shift when it needs to. Until then, it remains. This tolerance reflects how deeply warmth-seeking was understood. People did not view it as foolish or dangerous. It was simply part of a cat's nature. Just as humans drew closer to the fire in winter, cats did the same without shame or restraint. Sleep followed warmth naturally. Once settled, cats slept for long stretches. Their bodies relaxed fully, breathing deep and slow. Limbs tucked in, tails wrapped close. The world narrowed to heat, scent, and stillness. These long sleeps were not signs of laziness. They were part of a cycle. Cats conserved energy during periods of safety and warmth, so they could remain alert and capable during colder, darker hours. Rest was preparation, not escape. In medieval homes, this rest happened openly. Cats slept near people, near tools, near food stores. They did not retreat to hidden spaces unless disturbed. Their comfort came from proximity rather than isolation. A sleeping cat became part of the room's atmosphere. Its presence softened edges. Its stillness balanced movement. People learned to move around it without thinking, stepping carefully, shifting benches slightly, allowing the cat to remain undisturbed. Touch often happened during these moments. A hand passing by might rest briefly on a cat's back. Fingers might trace the curve of a sleeping body. The contact was casual, absent-minded, and easily forgotten. Sometimes the cat responded. A low vibration, a steady hum felt more than heard. Medieval writers described this sound as singing, a soft voice that emerged when a cat was content. The description is gentle and untechnical, focused on sensation rather than explanation. This sound required no audience. A cat purred for itself as much as for those nearby. It was part of settling, part of remaining comfortable and calm. Sleep stretched on. Hours passed. Light shifted across walls. Fires dimmed and were rekindled. Through it all, cats remained, adjusting slightly, but rarely leaving their chosen spots. In winter, this pattern deepened. Cold pressed harder. Nights grew longer. Cats slept closer to warmth and stayed there longer. Their movements slowed. Their world contracted around the hearth. People recognized this seasonal shift. A cat that slept more in winter did not raise concern. It was expected. The body followed the environment, just as human bodies did. Even when disturbed, cats returned to warmth. If moved aside during cooking, they found another warm place. If chased briefly from the fire, they waited and returned. Their persistence was quiet and unremarkable. Warmth was not a luxury. It was a necessity that shaped behavior, posture, and rest. Cats responded to it without conflict or excess. They took what was available and adapted when it changed. In doing so, they mirrored the lives around them. People also gathered near the hearth. People also slept longer in cold months. People also adjusted their days around heat and light. In this shared dependence, cats fit easily. They slept long and deeply. They woke only when needed. They returned to warmth again and again. And in the glow of fading embers, medieval life slowed, held in place by shared stillness and the quiet breathing of a cat at rest. Time in the medieval world moved with the seasons. Days lengthened and shortened. Work shifted. Food appeared and vanished. Animals adjusted without instruction, responding to changes in light, temperature, and abundance. Cats were no exception. Their lives turned quietly with the year, shaped by cycles rather than calendars. Spring brought movement. As cold loosened its hold, barns and fields filled with new life. Rodents multiplied, birds nested, warmth returned to the ground. Cats became more active, ranging farther, spending less time near the hearth and more time outdoors. Kittens appeared during this season. Litters were born in hidden corners, under hay, behind stacked wood, in unused spaces that offered shelter without disturbance. These births were rarely celebrated or recorded. They were expected. People noticed but did not intervene. Some kittens survived, others did not. The world was not structured to protect them. Survival depended on shelter, the mother's skill, and chance. This was accepted as part of life. By early summer, young cats began to follow their mothers. They watched, they practiced, they chased leaves, insects, and shadows, learning the movements that would one day become hunting. Their play blended into work without a clear boundary. What looked like play was preparation. Adult cats adjusted their routines. With prey abundant, hunting required less effort. Cats rested more during the heat of the day and moved in the cool hours of morning and evening. Their bodies grew lean and capable, shaped by repetition. Summer widened their world. Fields opened. Barn doors stayed ajar. Cats moved between spaces more freely, following scent trails and familiar paths. Their territory expanded, often beyond the household that loosely claimed them. This movement was tolerated. As long as cats returned occasionally and continued to reduce pests, their absences were not questioned. A cat that disappeared for days was assumed to be following food or shelter. Another might appear in its place. Autumn shifted everything again. Harvest brought grain into barns and storerooms. Food concentrated in fewer places. Rodents followed, and cats followed them. Activity increased near storage areas. Cats spent more time indoors, patrolling sacks and corners where mice gathered. The work became more focused. Night patrols lengthened. Attention sharpened. Cats positioned themselves where grain met darkness. The results were visible in the quiet mornings that followed. Fewer signs of damage, less loss. People recognized this change. Cats were tolerated more closely indoors during these months. Their presence near food stores was not only accepted, it was expected. Doors might be left open slightly, corners left undisturbed. Winter narrowed the world. Cold pressed in. Fields emptied. Movement slowed. Cats drew closer to warmth and shelter. They slept longer, hunted less frequently, and relied more on proximity to human spaces. Hunting still happened, but opportunity was reduced. Prey hid deeper. Snow and frost changed movement patterns. Cats adjusted by conserving energy, resting during daylight, and moving only when needed. Their bodies reflected this shift. Winter coats thickened. Movements became slower and more deliberate. A cat might spend days near the same hearth, leaving only when necessary. People adapted alongside them. Households accepted cats indoors more often. Their presence near fires and food stores increased. The boundaries between human and animal space softened further during cold months. Spring would return. Kittens would be born again. Fields would open. The cycle would repeat without ceremony. This rhythm required no explanation. Cats did not mark time by dates or feasts. They responded to what the world offered. Warmth, cold, abundance, scarcity. In this way, a barn cat's life became a quiet calendar. Spring meant movement and birth. Summer meant range and learning. Autumn meant focus and work. Winter meant rest and closeness. Year after year, these patterns repeated. And through them all, cats remained, adapting, enduring, living in time rather than against it. Beyond houses and hearths, medieval cats shaped their lives around the open spaces of farms. These were not neatly bounded environments. Fields stretched outward without fences. Paths shifted with use. Barns stood open through much of the year, and storage spaces were shared by people, animals, tools, and grain. Cats learned these landscapes through repetition, mapping them by scent, sound, and habit, rather than by sight alone. The threshing floor was one of the most important places. Here, grain was separated, poured, and stored. Chaff collected. Spilled kernels gathered along edges. Mice followed these traces closely, and cats followed the mice. A cat resting near a threshing floor was not idle. It was waiting where work would soon appear. Granaries drew cats for the same reason. These buildings held the outcome of months of labor. Grain sacks stacked against walls created narrow passages and dark corners. Rodents moved easily here, unseen by people. Cats learned these routes over time, memorizing entrances and hiding places. Their presence reduced loss quietly. A single cat could patrol a granary each night, leaving little sign of its work beyond absence. No traps needed to be set. No alarms raised. The cat's success was invisible and therefore ideal. Farm cats moved between these spaces fluidly. A cat might sleep in a barn during the day, hunt near the granary at night, and wander into the fields at dawn. It did not belong to one building alone. Its domain was the network of spaces where work and food overlapped. Field edges mattered as much as buildings. Hedges, stone walls, ditches, and fence lines marked places where mice crossed between open ground and shelter. Cats learned these crossings and positioned themselves accordingly. A cat waiting along a wall was not resting. It was watching. These edges were liminal spaces. Neither fully wild nor fully controlled, they offered cover and opportunity. Cats thrived here, blending into tall grass or low stone, remaining unseen until movement gave them reason to act. Farmers understood this instinctively. They did not chase cats from fields or barns. They allowed them to move freely, trusting that the cat knew where it was needed. Interference would only disrupt the work. This tolerance was reinforced by belief. In many rural traditions, harming a cat was considered dangerous. Stories warned that killing or mistreating a cat could bring misfortune. Crops might fail. Cattle might fall ill. These beliefs functioned as quiet protections, encouraging restraint rather than cruelty. Whether believed fully or not, the result was the same. Cats were left alone. This freedom allowed them to shift between farms when needed. If food grew scarce or shelter disappeared, a cat might move on. Another might arrive. These movements followed the landscape rather than human boundaries. Farmers accepted this. They did not attempt to claim cats permanently. The presence of a cat mattered more than its identity. What mattered was that someone was watching the grain at night. Over time, cats became part of the farm's ecology. They reduced rodent populations. They altered movement patterns. They occupied spaces that might otherwise have been left unchecked. Their influence extended beyond any single building. Cats also adapted to the rhythms of agricultural work. During harvest, activity increased. Cats remained close to storage areas. During quieter months, they ranged farther, following prey into fields and hedges. Their movements mirrored the labor cycle without needing instruction. In these open environments, cats remained mostly unseen. They blended into shadows and grass. They left few traces beyond paw prints in soft earth, or the occasional remains of a hunt. Their work continued without acknowledgement. People noticed only the results. Grain stayed intact. Fewer mice appeared in daylight. Storage losses decreased. These outcomes reinforced tolerance and trust. Farm cats did not seek affection. They accepted touch when offered, but they did not linger for it. Their focus remained outward, toward edges and crossings, toward movement in tall grass and dark corners. Their lives were shaped by space rather than by people. They belonged to the farm as a whole, not to any individual. They moved where they were needed, guided by instinct and familiarity. At field edges and within barns, cats lived quietly, shaping the medieval countryside without drawing attention to themselves. They were present where work met land, where shelter met openness, where small movements mattered, and there, along walls and grain sacks and tall grass, they remained. In medieval towns, cats followed a different rhythm. Stone replaced soil, walls replaced hedges. The open spaces of farms narrowed into lanes, courtyards, and crowded streets. Food moved through markets rather than fields, and waste gathered where people gathered. Cats adapted to this environment without pause. They learned the city by sound and scent. Alleys carried echoes. Footsteps announced themselves long before they arrived. The smell of fish, bread, and refuse marked places of opportunity. Cats memorized these signals, mapping the town in layers rather than lines. Markets were central to this life. Fishmongers cleaned their stalls at dawn. Bakers discarded scraps. Vendors packed up at dusk, leaving behind crumbs and waste. Mice followed these patterns closely, and cats followed the mice. A cat waiting near a market stall was not idle. It understood timing. It knew when activity would peak and when quiet would return. It positioned itself near walls beneath carts beside stacked crates. From there, it watched. Dockyards offered a similar draw. Ships brought food and waste from far away. Grain sacks were unloaded. Fish were gutted. Ropes and barrels created dark passages where rodents thrived. Cats moved through these spaces freely, tolerated because they reduced pests and asked for little. They did not belong to the docks. They belonged to the pattern. At twilight, when stalls closed and crowds thinned, cats became more visible. They crossed open spaces, climbed steps, and moved along walls with practiced ease. The town softened as noise faded, and cats expanded their range. Rooftops became pathways. Tiles and beams offered elevated routes above human movement. Cats balanced along narrow edges, moving from building to building without touching the ground. These routes were quiet and efficient, allowing cats to avoid conflict and travel widely. People noticed this movement without reacting. A cat on a roof did not cause alarm. It was part of the town's silhouette, as familiar as chimneys or birds. Its presence overhead went unremarked. Street life required tolerance. Cats wove between legs, slipped through doorways, and rested against walls. They were not chased unless they caused trouble, which they rarely did. Their small size and quiet behavior made them easy to ignore. This invisibility was their strength. Cats did not compete with people for space. They occupied the margins, under benches, beside doors, in corners where light faded. In some towns, individual cats became loosely known. A bakery cat, a dock cat, a cat that slept near a particular doorway. These associations did not imply ownership. They reflected repetition. A cat returned often enough to be noticed, and that was enough. Food came irregularly. A fish head tossed aside, a crust dropped, a scrap swept toward the wall. These offerings supplemented hunting without replacing it. Cats remained self-sufficient. Urban life sharpened their instincts. Movement was constant. Danger came from carts, dogs, and people. Cats learned when to freeze and when to flee. They learned to read the town's moods. At night, the city belonged to them. Shops closed, streets emptied, sounds changed. Cats moved more freely, patrolling warehouses, slipping through courtyards, crossing open ground that felt crowded during the day. Their work remained the same: protect food, reduce pests, move quietly. People rarely acknowledged this labor. They noticed only its absence. Fewer rats, less spoilage, quieter nights. In towns, as on farms, cats fit because they asked for nothing. They did not demand space. They did not demand care. They took what the city offered and gave back quiet order. Among alleys and markets, cats lived in rhythm with human life without joining it. They moved when people paused. They watched from the edges. They made the city livable, one quiet night at a time. Some medieval cats lived lives shaped by movement. Not all cats stayed near a single hearth or barn. Along rivers, coasts, and trade routes, cats entered a different rhythm, one defined by departure and return. Ships came and went. Cargo shifted. Ports changed faces daily. And within this motion, cats moved quietly alongside people. Ships were vulnerable places. Food was stored in tight spaces. Grain, dried meat, and rope attracted rodents quickly. Mice gnawed through supplies and damaged wood. On a long voyage, this was more than an inconvenience. It threatened survival. Cats offered a solution that required no explanation. A cat aboard a ship hunted without instruction. It moved through holds and along decks, slipping into narrow spaces where humans could not follow. Its presence reduced loss without drawing attention to itself. The work happened while sailors slept or focused elsewhere. Because of this, cats were tolerated easily. No special care was required. A place to sleep, occasional scraps, access to the ship's interior. In return, the cat did what it had always done. It hunted. Life at sea did not unsettle cats as much as one might expect. They adapted to the movement of the vessel, learning the rhythm of waves beneath their paws. They found stable places to rest among cargo and ropes. Storms passed over them. Calm returned. The ship became another territory to memorize. When ships reached port, cats stepped ashore. Harbors were crowded, noisy places during the day. Fish were unloaded, barrels rolled, voices overlapped. Cats remained near the edges, watching from walls and stacks, waiting for evening. At night, port softened, dockyards emptied, sounds thinned. Cats moved freely between ships and shore, exploring warehouses, markets, and alleys. Some returned to the ship they came from. Others lingered. No one forced a decision. A cat might remain ashore if food and shelter were plentiful. Another might board the next vessel leaving port. The choice depended on opportunity rather than loyalty. This movement connected places quietly. Cats traveled between regions without being recorded. A ship departing one harbor carried not only goods and people, but animals shaped by a different landscape. When the ship arrived elsewhere, those cats stepped into new environments, mingling briefly with local populations. Over time, this created subtle change. Cats in port towns often appeared varied in size, coat, and behavior. These differences were not named or studied. They were simply noticed and accepted. A cat that hunted well belonged, regardless of where it came from. Travel did not make cats exceptional. A ship's cat was not treated differently from a barn cat or a street cat. It did not carry status. It carried instinct. Ports themselves suited cats well. They were liminal spaces, neither fully settled nor fully transient. Goods passed through. People stayed briefly. Waste gathered. Rodents followed. Cats thrived. A cat might sleep on a coil of rope one night, then beneath a market stall the next. It learned the port's rhythms quickly. When ships arrived, when food appeared, when silence returned. Some cats followed trade routes repeatedly. They moved from port to port, not because they were directed, but because the pattern suited them. Ships offered shelter and hunting grounds. Ports offered variety and abundance. The cycle repeated. Others stayed. A cat might settle permanently near a dockyard, becoming part of its nightly routine. Sailors would recognize it. Dock workers would step around it. No one would claim it. This flexibility defined their success. Cats did not resist movement or cling to place. They responded to conditions. Where food gathered, they gathered. Where shelter appeared, they rested. Their lineage spread through habit rather than plan. No one set out to transport cats across seas. It happened because cats followed work, and work moved. Centuries passed this way. Ships crossed waters. Ports grew and declined. Trade routes shifted. Through all of it, cats continued to appear where they were needed, stepping on and off ships without ceremony. They left no records of their journeys, but they carried them in their bodies, in their adaptability, in their quiet confidence in unfamiliar places. Whether on deck or dockside, cats remained what they had always been: independent, effective, unconcerned with origin, as long as the work continued. And wherever ships came and went, cats followed, moving through medieval Europe without leaving a trace loud enough to be remembered. Alongside daily routines and practical arrangements, belief moved quietly through medieval life. It did not always announce itself. It did not need to be agreed upon or written down. It lingered instead, shaping small reactions, half-formed thoughts, and moments of pause. Cats existed within this atmosphere, not as fixed symbols, but as living beings whose behavior invited interpretation. Cats moved mostly at night. They slipped through darkness with ease, appearing suddenly in doorways or at the edge of firelight. Their eyes reflected light in unfamiliar ways. Their bodies seemed to arrive and vanish without warning. These traits were noticed, and over time, they gathered meaning. People did not need stories to begin with fear. A cat staring into an empty corner, a cat freezing suddenly, alert to something unseen, a cat crossing a threshold without sound. These moments were ordinary, yet they unsettled slightly. They suggested awareness beyond human senses. From this suggestion, belief grew. In medieval thinking, belief rarely functioned as doctrine. It operated more like weather. Some days it was present and heavy. Other days it passed unnoticed. It influenced behavior subtly rather than decisively. A person might hesitate before stepping over a cat's path. Another might avoid touching one in low light. These gestures were not laws. They were instincts shaped by shared stories and observation. Black cats carried additional weight. Their color absorbed light. Their outlines blurred into shadow. At night, they appeared almost disembodied, eyes floating where bodies were hard to see. This visual effect alone was enough to stir unease. But fear did not define daily life. A black cat might be watched warily and still be allowed near the hearth. It might be associated with rumor and still receive scraps. Belief did not override habit. Cats continued to live among people. They slept in busy rooms. They hunted in storerooms. They moved through streets and barns as they always had. Belief hovered around them without displacing them. Religious writers sometimes gave voice to this unease. Cats were described as creatures of the night, as beings who saw what others could not. In some texts, they became examples used to warn or instruct. Yet these descriptions often relied on real observation rather than invention. A cat's silence, a cat's patience, a cat's sudden motion. These traits were real. Belief simply layered meaning onto them. At the same time, belief remained inconsistent. The same cat that caused hesitation might also be valued for its work. The same household that whispered about cats might rely on them to protect food. Contradiction was not a problem to be solved. It was accepted. This flexibility allowed cats to remain. Belief did not demand action. It suggested caution, not removal. It shaped tone rather than policy. In monasteries, this balance was especially clear. Some preachers warned against excess affection toward animals, seeing it as indulgence. Yet cats continued to curl near desks and walls. The warning existed alongside the practice, without resolution. People lived comfortably with this tension. They did not require certainty. They allowed belief to remain ambient, influencing mood rather than behavior. Cats fit into this space easily. They did not respond to belief. They did not alter their behavior in response to rumor or fear. They continued to sleep, hunt, and move according to instinct. Over time, belief adapted to them, rather than the other way around. A cat that remained useful was tolerated. A cat that remained familiar was accepted. Belief softened around routine. This is why cats were never fully absorbed into superstition. They were too present, too ordinary, too woven into daily life to be reduced to symbol alone. Belief moved around them like mist, sometimes thick, sometimes thin, always shifting. And beneath it, cats remained grounded in the physical world, moving through stone rooms and dark alleys, responding to warmth, hunger, and sound. They did not carry meaning intentionally. Meaning gathered around them. And when belief passed, as weather does, the cat was still there, unchanged, quietly continuing its life in the spaces between fear and familiarity. Medieval feelings toward cats rarely settled into a single story. They drifted instead, moving between comfort and caution, familiarity and distance. A cat could be welcomed one moment and watched carefully the next, without anyone feeling the need to resolve the contradiction. This ambivalence was not confusion. It was simply how people lived with things they did not try to fully explain. In many coastal communities, cats were considered lucky. Sailors trusted them aboard ships, not only because they reduced rodents, but because their presence suggested order in an uncertain environment. A calm cat during rough weather was taken as a good sign. A cat that chose to remain on a vessel rather than flee it seemed to approve of the journey ahead. These beliefs were practical as much as symbolic. A ship with fewer rats was safer. A calm animal suggested stability. Luck and usefulness blended together easily, and no one felt compelled to separate them. On land, smaller signs gathered meaning. A cat sneezing, a cat washing its face, a cat pausing suddenly and refusing to cross a space. These actions were noted casually. They were mentioned in passing, not treated as prophecy. They added texture to daily life rather than direction. At the same time, warnings circulated. Stories cautioned against harming cats. Misfortune might follow. Illness might appear. Livestock might suffer. These tales discouraged cruelty without requiring enforcement. They operated quietly, encouraging restraint through unease rather than fear. Importantly, these warnings did not demand action. They did not require people to drive cats away or treat them differently. They simply suggested caution. A pause. A second thought. Cats remained present. They slept by the hearth. They accepted scraps. They hunted in barns and storerooms. Belief hovered above these routines without disrupting them. In monasteries, this tension appeared clearly. Some religious writers criticized excessive fondness for animals, seeing it as distraction or indulgence. Yet cats continued to be allowed within cloisters and cells. They curled near desks. They moved through corridors. The criticism existed alongside acceptance, unresolved and unremarked. People did not feel compelled to choose sides. A cat could be useful and unsettling at once. It could be ordinary and slightly strange. These qualities did not cancel each other out. During times of crisis, this ambivalence sharpened but did not disappear. Illness, famine, and uncertainty heightened suspicion. Explanations were sought where none were certain. Cats, already associated with night and silence, sometimes became part of these fears. And yet, practical needs remained. Rodents did not vanish during crisis. Food still needed protection. Grain still spoiled if left unattended. Cats continued to work, and people continued to rely on them. Fear adjusted to necessity. Even when suspicion grew louder, daily routines pulled it back. A cat was still needed in the barn, still tolerated near the fire, still useful in the storeroom. Belief bent around habit. This is why cats were never fully embraced as symbols of luck, nor fully condemned as objects of fear. They remained too embedded in daily life for extremes to hold. Ambivalence became their protection. Because no single belief defined them, none could fully erase them. Cats lived in the space between stories, where routine outweighed interpretation. People learned to live with uncertainty. They did not demand clarity from cats. They accepted inconsistency. They allowed belief to remain flexible, changing with circumstance and mood. This flexibility mirrored the cat itself. Cats did not commit to people fully. They did not reject them either. They remained near, but not dependent. Present, but not demanding. In this mutual distance, stability formed. Cats were trusted enough to stay, feared enough to be respected, ordinary enough to be ignored. This balance allowed them to persist through centuries of change. While beliefs rose and faded, cats continued to sleep, hunt, and move quietly through medieval life. They did not need to be fully understood. They only needed to be allowed. And in that allowance, they endured, moving gently between luck and fear, never fully claimed by either, quietly unchanged by the stories told about them. When medieval cats appear most clearly to us now, they are often not at the center of the page. They are found along the edges, in the corners, in places meant for decoration, humor, or accident rather than record. This is fitting because it mirrors how cats lived at the time. In the margins, medieval manuscripts are filled with small, playful images drawn where formal text ends. Along these borders, cats chase mice, sit beneath tables, or wander through imagined scenes. They are drawn with familiarity rather than reverence. Their shapes are instantly recognizable, their behavior unsurprising. A cat leaping after a mouse. A cat curled near a figure's feet. A cat interrupting a serious moment with quiet motion. These images were not meant to teach doctrine. They reflected daily life. Anyone who saw them understood the reference immediately. Cats belonged in these spaces because they belonged everywhere else as well. Sometimes their presence was not intentional at all. In at least one surviving manuscript, a cat stepped across a page before the ink had dried. Small paw prints trail through the text, crossing lines carefully written by a human hand. The scribe noted the interruption with mild annoyance, then continued. The marks were not erased. They remain visible centuries later, a physical record of a living animal moving freely through a place of work and care. The cat did not know it was leaving history behind. It was simply walking where it always walked. These traces tell us more than formal descriptions ever could. They show that cats were not excluded from important spaces. They were not shut out of scriptoria or workshops. They moved through rooms where knowledge was preserved and copied, leaving small signs of their presence without consequence. No one punished the cat. No one sealed the room against it. Life went on. In art, cats appear in domestic scenes not as symbols to be decoded, but as signals of realism. A room feels inhabited when a cat is present. A hearth looks complete when a cat rests nearby. Artists understood this instinctively. They placed cats where viewers would expect them, trusting shared experience rather than explanation. The cat's presence did not need emphasis. It needed only to be there. Across centuries, the same images repeat. A cat beneath a table, a cat by the fire, a cat watching quietly from the edge of a room. The repetition is not dramatic. It is steady. While kings changed and borders shifted, cats remained in these small spaces. They did not follow political timelines. They followed warmth, food, and quiet opportunity. This continuity is what defines medieval cats most clearly. They did not need to be celebrated to endure. They did not need to be written about at length. Their lives unfolded alongside human lives without intersecting loudly. History often remembers noise, wars, crises, declarations. Cats existed beneath these layers, unaffected by most of them. A plague might pass through a city, but afterward, cats still moved through the same alleys. A cathedral might be rebuilt, but a cat would still find warmth along its walls. Even belief shifted around them. Superstition rose and faded. Fear gathered and dispersed. Through it all, cats continued to hunt, sleep, and move quietly between rooms. The margins held them because the margins were where life happened when no one was watching closely. They were present in kitchens and barns, in ports and monasteries, in the quiet hours between day and night. They left few records because they did not interrupt anything enough to require one. And yet, they were always there, in paw prints pressed into ink, in sketches along page edges, in the shared memory of what a room felt like when a cat occupied it. Looking back now, it becomes clear that medieval cats did not live on the sidelines of history. They lived alongside it, unrecorded, unremarked, unchanged. While centuries passed overhead, cats remained in the background, shaping daily life through presence rather than action, continuity rather than disruption. By the hearth, along the wall, in the margins, and when everything else faded into record and interpretation, the quiet outline of the cat stayed exactly where it had always been.